All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Keck, and I'm one of the life group teachers here at the Hill Life Group at First Baptist Church in Mansfield, and this is your Hill Review for the week. And by the way, this Hill Review is for the Sunday of February the 25th. And yes, it is now March 19th, and I am just now getting to this podcast. I must apologize for that. I did get sick and I lost my voice, so I've been kind of waiting for 3 weeks for that voice to come back, and it's not fully back yet. So, but anyway, I'm going to try to get it done and see if we can get the podcast done from the 25th of February so that I can load all these podcasts in so we can get back up to speed. So thank you very much for joining me. We are back in, we're kind of back up a little bit, obviously, because we're back to February 25th, but we are in Ruth chapter 1, starting at verse 16 through verse 18 for this particular review. So in this particular part of Scripture, we have the book of Ruth, which was written, as it says in the first few verses of the book. It was written during the time of Judges. So while there's no actual pinpoint of when the book was actually written, we do know that it was during the time of Judges. It was also during the time of a great famine that had been taking place in Bethlehem of Judah, where our subjects for this particular verse today have come from. So I want to kind of just back you up a little bit. Our scripture does start in verse 6, but I want to back you up to verse 5 to get a little bit of a background as to what's happening in the book of Ruth at this particular moment in time. So in verse 5, verse 1 through 5, we do learn that, again, it is in the time of Judges. We look at Elimelech and his wife Naomi. They fled Moab. They fled to Moab from Bethlehem because of this famine that was in Bethlehem at that point in time. They had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. So we have Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. These are the men of this family. And Elimelech died. Okay, the scripture says that Elimelech died. That's the husband of Naomi. He died. And Mahlon and Chilion took two Moabite women as their wives, and that was Orpah and Ruth, and they lived there for 10 years until Mahlon and Chilion also died. So now what we have, just to kind of set the stage for you, is we have Naomi, who is mom, and we have Orpah and Ruth, who are daughter-in-laws to Naomi right now. And all three of them have now lost their husbands. The scripture doesn't really tell us exactly what happened or how we lost our husbands during this time frame, but that's what happened, and that's where we pick up from right there. So now we're in verse 6, and in verse 6, we see Naomi. She and her daughter-in-laws, they prepare to leave the land of Moab. And this is because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's needs by providing them food. What that means is, back in Bethlehem, back in the homeland where Naomi is from, the famine has stopped and God has begun to pay attention to his people. And so Naomi hears about this, and a lot of things are probably going through Naomi's mind at this point in time. First of all, man, we should have never left in the first place. The reason that there was probably a famine in that area is because the people had already abandoned God. And we know that in scriptures past that's one of the things that happens whenever God's people abandon him, is that there could be a famine. He can dry up the land. There could be no crops. So she and her husband probably left during a time when it was really important not to leave. They probably left and fled just for themselves so they can eat and have security in their lives. And truth be told was, the people of God at that time probably had their backs turned to God, so they weren't helping by fleeing. And I think Naomi's just now starting to realize that. She's thinking, man, we should have never left. Who knows if her husband would have died had they stayed at home and started to do their part in helping God's people turn back toward God. But nevertheless, what happened was they fled. she's starting to feel like she shouldn't have fled. She's starting to hear that God is allowing plants to grow and taking in and paying attention to His people again, and that the Bethlehem is where she really needs to be. So there's a problem with that, and the problem is we have two daughter-in-laws whom she cares for greatly. As a matter of fact, when we look at Scripture here, she calls them daughters. As she goes through Scripture here, she calls them, which is a term of endearment. This is a display for her love of Orpah and Ruth. Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show faithful love to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord enable each of you to find security in the house of your new husband. She kissed them and wept loudly. And so Naomi is telling the girls now, you guys need to go back to your home, all right? Because she's warning them, I'm going back to my home. Now, Naomi's a little older than her daughter-in-laws, obviously, and really Naomi has nothing to provide for them, nothing to give them. So if the daughter-in-laws were to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem, there's nothing that she can give to those two to help them and provide them security or food or shelter or anything like that. And she will go on in Scripture to even further describe what she means by that. But as she's going through 6 through 8, she's begging her daughter-in-laws, go back home. Go back to your mothers. There's a couple of things to think about here. She's fixing to go to Bethlehem, right? If the daughter-in-laws were to go with them, not only because she has nothing to provide for them, but they are foreigners there. They're Moabites. They're from a completely different land. They're from a land of people who are genuinely or generally enemies of Israel. And so they would be foreigners coming into foreign territory. They would have no security, no husbands. They would have nothing with them to be able to continuously live a happy life the way that they are where they're at right now. So she encourages them, go home, go back to your mothers, and all of that. We see in verse 10, they said no. That's what they both told her. We will go with you to your people. But Naomi replied, go home, my daughters. And right there is the term that I was telling you about, daughters, this display of love for them. Go home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons? Now, this is a reference to the Levirate marriage. Now, the Levirate marriage was simply enough where, if a man were to die and leave a widow, the man's brother, living brother, next in line brother, would take that woman, take that widow as his wife, and bear children with her in order to keep his brother's lineage alive. So that the children wouldn't actually be considered his child. It would be considered his brother's child, even though basic genetics and everything tells us that's obviously not his brother's child, but that was what the Levirate marriage was all about. And so Naomi goes in here and she says, again, after they said, no, we're not going to go, we want to go with you, Naomi replies, says, go home, my daughters. And then she has this question here, am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? That's because she had 2 sons. Both of them have now died. So the Levirate marriage at this point in time can't even work for them. They can't even have a husband under the Levirate marriage that would provide them with security or anything like that. And so she says, I literally have nothing to provide for you if you were to go with me. So turn and go home, please, is what she's asking them. And so we see as we move on a little bit down here in 11 through 14, I have nothing to provide for you. I cannot. And even if I could, it goes on to say, even if I could have more sons, would you seriously, would you really wait for them to grow up before they could be your husband? And so that's obviously not going to happen. They understand it's obviously not going to happen. And she is trying back and forth to convince them, will you just go home? Will you just go back to your mothers? My life, it says in verse 13, my life is much too bitter for you to share because the Lord's hand has turned against me. All right, so she realizes that God's hand is always on top of her. God's hand is always involved in everything that's going on right now. But she feels like she's in a bad position right now in life. And so she says, it's not smart for you all to come with me. It's not smart for you to do that. I'm in a bad position. I can't provide for you. And you would be going to a completely foreign land. Now, here's where it becomes very, very interesting. They all wept. They all cried. They all hugged each other and shared that love with one another, because they knew that for them to separate was the end of an era, if you will. It was the loss of a loved one, if you will, because chances are they wouldn't get to see each other hardly ever again if they go home, like they were told to go home. So again, they wept loudly. Now listen to this. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And guess what happens next? Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. So Orpah kissed Naomi and then turned and went home as instructed. Ruth, however, clung to her. Ruth couldn't be budged. Ruth was not about to let go. Ruth was fully committed to staying with Naomi no matter what, wherever you go. Orpah kissed and left. However, Ruth clung to her mother-in-law. I got to think sometimes, are we kissers or are we clingers? And I heard this from a commentator one time, and he said, are we kissers or are we clingers? You know, think about your life. Think about following Jesus each and every single day. Do we kiss Jesus when he does good for us and when he helps us and when we need him, but then we turn back to our lives each and every day and we go back to what we know, and we just come to Jesus when we need him or whatever, and we kiss him and we thank him for what he's done? Or are we clingers? Do we cling to Christ each and every day? And no matter where he takes us, no matter where we go, we will follow him no matter what. So are we kissers or are we clingers? You see, Ruth was fully committed. She says in Scripture right here, I will go wherever you go. I will live wherever you live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I will die where you die. And I will be buried where you are buried. I mean, that's pretty intense right there. And that is absolutely what Naomi needed to hear. Naomi dropped the subject right then and there. And she knew that Ruth was going to be with her. And Ruth, no matter whether or not she had security, no matter whether or not she was going into a foreign territory, it didn't matter what was fixing to happen in life. Ruth was 100% fully committed to being with Naomi now and forever. And I compared that in class to Peter. Was Peter a kisser or a clunger? You see, Peter, when we look in all of our Gospels, we see Peter say things like, you know, where you go, I go. Where you live, I will live. Where your people are, my people are. You know, where your God is, my God is. If you die, I will die. But then we also see, we see Peter in Matthew 26:33. I will never run. We see him in the book of Mark. I will never run. We see him in the book of Luke. I will go with you to prison and to death. We see him in the book of John. I will lay down my life for you. But then we see Peter shortly after each one of these, I will never run, and yet Matthew 26:74, I don't know the man. And in the book of Mark, I don't know the man. And in the book of Luke, I don't know what you're talking about. And in the book of John, Peter denies it again. So Peter was a kisser at that time. You know, it's great to be with you. I love you. I want to be with you. He was a kisser and then went back to his normal life. Peter became a clinger over time. Are we kissers or are we clingers? And I think it's a very important thing for us to figure out in our own lives. Do we want to be the kisser who can kiss and go back to where we normally do? Or do we want to be a clinger of Christ, never letting go, no matter where you lead me, no matter where you take me, I will follow you each and every moment of each and every day, no matter what that brings, no matter where we go? We have to figure out what the answer to that question is. And we have to figure out who we are. And if we are kissers, we need to become clingers. We need to find out how to become clingers. And one way to do that is simply enough. Deny yourself daily. Take up your cross and follow Christ each and every day. Be a clinger. Cling to him no matter what he says, no matter where he says to go. Maybe it's a foreign land with no food and no security. But that's where Christ wants you to go. We need to be a clinger and cling to him, just as Ruth did to Naomi. Hope you have a good week. Thank you very much for listening.